Hi, class. Last spring, my students asked that I record the history lessons so that they could go back and hear my information when I lecture. So what you see in front of me is basically your textbook, but it's in a PDF format, and I'll just have it up here as I kind of lecture based on what I'm seeing here. So to start, I know we've already discussed the fall of Rome, but this is kind of the last little piece before we go into feudalism in our textbook. So you all know that the Roman Empire was huge, spanned the whole of the Mediterranean world, from North Africa to the Scottish border, and then from Spain to Syria. We know that the reason for the fall were three main reasons. It was the political instability, economic and social problems, and the weakening of the frontier. Now, with the political instability, the transfer of power to a new leader was difficult. We saw this in what we've studied so far. Independent armies would often fight each other for the emperor's crown, and these battles for who was going to be in charge eventually made the citizens kind of turn to help themselves and form their own pseudo democracies within the land. We know that the economic and social problems were huge because Rome was so vast, they needed a big army, and that cost money. So they had to really tax heavily its citizens, and that was no bueno for the citizens because there weren't many job opportunities, so they didn't have the money. So what happened was more crime, a decline in the spirit of the citizenship, and more corruption, which is never good. Um, as for the weakening of the frontier, again, we've talked about how big this area is. It was very hard to defend, and eventually the Germanic tribes moved in, especially on the western borders, and took over. Fortunately, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, um, had a pretty strong leader, Constantine, and he was able to um, move its capital, later called Constantinople after Constantine, which allowed it to um, last for 1,000 years, which was a good long time. Now, we know that there was contributions. Roman art, you'll see this come up again in medieval when we talk about the medieval art and when we talk about Roman art. These Greco-Roman um, artists or art um, was very unique for its time. But like I said, we see it now, this kind of realistic way of art, the sculptures and the people that were shown in these sculptures, kind of bigger than life. If somebody was going to have muscles, this sculpture was definitely going to have muscles and a great looking jawline. Um, so yes, realistic, but also the best realistic we could possibly be. They had the mosaics, which were really pretty. Um, it reminds me of stained glass, a bunch of little pieces of glass put together to make a picture. These beautiful frescoes that almost look three-dimensional, usually having to do with nature. There was gem cutting, so for jewels, metalwork, and blown glass. And if you've ever been to the Sawdust Festival in Laguna Beach, you can see some of this art being made, especially the glass blowing is so fascinating. Next came the architecture and engineering. It doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but they built the Colosseum was in Rome. There were tunnels within that grand stadium. Modern football stadiums are modeled after that. And so the architecture was amazing. They were able to create these arcs and vaults and domes that allowed for bigger, stronger structures. They built roads, which may not seem that, advanced, but definitely a lot smoother ride and probably could go farther if roads were created in different areas. And then, of course, bridges and aqueducts, which you need that water system in order to create a civilization where you can actually farm in the community. And as you learned with civilizations, that's how you become a civilization, because you can actually stay there and live off the land. We also had the the language and writing. They had an alphabet, the Latin alphabet, 23 letters. Ours is a little bit different. We have 26. And although, you know, I don't know anybody that speaks Latin, but people do. But it's kind of a romantic language, and one that's not spoken not here in Huntington Beach, that's for sure. But we do use a lot of the prefixes, suffixes, root words come from the Latin language. Proverbs are like little sayings. And there's actually one of those little sayings on our US penny, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. So we've used Latin proverbs in our language, and then, of course, Roman numerals. And then philosophy. We talked about Stoicism, but this was kind of a Greek school of thought. And I kind of look at it as like a romantic way of thinking that, it's Stoics believed that a divine intelligence ruled all of nature. I'm reading this actually right here. It says a person's soul was the spark of that divine intelligence. Living rightly meant living in a way that agreed with nature. So those are those morals and values that you're born with. You know what's right, you know what's wrong, you know how to be good to people, to nature, to humanity. And those people that were stoic were truly good in their life and good in their character. So that was really important, which I certainly like that aspect of stoicism. Also, law and justice. That was something that was the beginning of what would be democratic views, having certain legal codes people needed to follow, having people, not just the partisans, be the ones that actually rule. But remember, the Flavians could rule as well. Following natural law, the idea of justice, even having things similar to the judges and juries. And that was all echoed in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, England, when the British came to the Americas, they had already settled on a Bill of Rights, and we copied our Bill of Rights to that. To be a citizen meant that you were proud of your country. You would fight for your country. You would support your country and your fellow citizens, your fellow countrymen. It was a privilege to be a citizen and a responsibility. And that is something that we still adhere to in the United States. It is a privilege to be an American, and it's our responsibility to do right by our Constitution. And that's something that we have taken from the Roman Empire.